We're happy to have you with us wherever you are in the world today. We raise and maintain the good chi, as you know, the essential energy, as it were. The subject of our conversation today is conversation. Our guest on this program grew up believing that he had no natural ability in communication, but Rob Kendall developed a fascination for learning the skills of conversation, and his subsequent career is focused on professional coaching and writing in this field. He's written a book called Blamestorming: Why Conversations Go Wrong and How to Fix Them. Rob, you've worn a number of interesting hats throughout your work life, including working with amputees in India when you were a teenager. What drew you away from that work and eventually to the communications area?
Good evening, John. Well, I think there's a very interesting link between the two. When I was out working in India at the age of 18, I would consider myself to have been quite shy and introverted. I found myself in a situation where I was working with people who were coming from all over India to get new legs and arms fitted, and I didn't speak any Hindi. And so it was a wonderful lesson for me in terms of how do you communicate with people who have a very different existence from me, who speak a different language from me. And I suppose that started my journey really, and my lifelong fascination with understanding the dynamics of conversation.
Well, as a one-time self-proclaimed introvert, readers of the book can take heart from that. Is there any sort of a timeline for this, for making the kind of transition you did and really coming out of your shell?
I think the thing, John, that I've learned most over that period is to start paying attention to the dynamics of conversation. I think we often get constrained by a belief that we're either good at it or we're not. Obviously, some people are more extroverted by nature, and certain aspects of conversation come more easily to them than others. But at the same time, I think if you look at conversation as being something much bigger and greater than being about social skills, it's also, of course, hugely about listening. It's about your ability to negotiate, to have tough and difficult conversations, to get on the same wavelength of people of many different backgrounds and ages. And I think the biggest realization I found is that it's something that you can learn as a skill, like any other skill. And it started with me with starting to pay attention more to the dynamics of the conversation. So normally, any conversation we're having, we get very wrapped up in the content and we get wrapped up in what we want to say next. But my journey really started with thinking about what's actually going on here, what's the dynamics of the conversation, what's driving the conversation, and then also starting to think about what are the practices that would enable me to have more conversation that's more effective.
Well, in Blamestorming, you help us work around some of the minefields that can lurk in our conversations, and you focus on 4 situations: the tangle, the big argument, the bad place, and the lockdown. All of them were familiar to me and probably will be to readers too. Go over those and talk about exactly what they are.
Yes, well, as you say, there were 4 situations that I wanted to focus on more than anything. The first one is the tangle. And tangle, I suppose, is not necessarily where there's a disagreement, but maybe there are crossed wires. You go into a conversation and maybe you're clear about what you want to say, and you come out and you shake your head in bewilderment and you wonder, where did that all go wrong? So that's the first one. The second one is a little different. It's what I call the big argument. And the big argument is really where a conversation spirals out of control. Maybe it starts with something very trivial, just a one-off comment that provides the spark for an argument. And we find ourselves very, very quickly in a conversation that escalates in intensity. and where it seems to suddenly become about who's right and who's wrong, rather than the content of the conversation that we started to have. So those are the first two, and then the second two situations are more the product of a conversation that's gone wrong. So the first one I called the bad plays, and that's really where a conversation has gone in the wrong direction. You're left feeling disconnected or fed up with somebody, and often wondering, how on earth did we get into this situation in the first place? And then the last one is the lockdown. And by the lockdown, I really mean that sometimes we have a conversation where at the end of it, somebody feels hurt and they retreat from the relationship with you. It's like the portcullis has come down and they retreat into their shell. And so the things I really wanted to focus on in Blamestorming is, firstly, how can you avoid the tangle and the big argument from happening? What are the things that would allow you to steer clear of those situations? And then on the basis that we're never going to get all our conversations right. If we do find ourselves in a bad place or find ourselves in the lockdown, what are the ways that we can get out of those situations and restore our relationship with somebody else?
Well, I like that you say that reaching conversation effectiveness begins with watching conversation. We can find ourselves in some pretty heated exchanges now and then. What do we look for to keep the lid on things and make our communication more effective?
Well, I think that's a good point. If you just take, for example, escalation, one of the things I talk about in the book is that sometimes when conversations escalate, they go through different stages. So, for instance, there's a stage where there's a criticism or a perceived criticism that's made, and then our natural reaction to that is to either justify our point of view or to have a counter criticism that goes back to the other person. And from there, it seems to move up a level often, where we start making sweeping comments. Maybe we say, you never do this, or you always do that. And from there, the intensity and the speed of the conversation starts to increase. Listening often deteriorates. And then, of course, when we don't feel that we're getting heard, there's an intense sense of frustration. And then that's also why the volume tends to increase. And often we suddenly find ourselves in this situation where maybe we're dragging up incidents from the past, or we're perhaps making comparisons with other people and say, well, you do this, but they don't do that. And all the while, the intensity is increasing. And then often, conversation like that gets to a point where I call it the lid blows off it. And what happens is somebody slams the door or retreats out of the room. And I think what's interesting is when you understand those dynamics in a conversation, then it's not that you're not going to have arguments any longer, but you can see yourself going through those stages. Mm-hmm. And what I find is when you can see yourself and notice yourself going through those stages, it gives you an opportunity to take a different direction. So, for example, one of the things that I say that reduces escalation is pressing the stop button. And that is when you notice it's going in the wrong direction and consciously choosing to say, hang on, this isn't working, and it's going to get us into a bad place here. Let's just stop the conversation and we'll come back to it a bit later on when we've had a bit more opportunity for reflection. And simple practices like that, I find, make an enormous difference to the quality of those conversations and preventing ourselves getting into the bad place.
One of the excuses that those who are afraid to get in front of a crowd or even a small group to have a discussion, one of the excuses they use is that I'm not very good at speaking, or the person I just listened to has the gift of gab. That's the expression we like to use. Is there such a thing as a born conversationalist? I mean, after reading the book, I thought we can all really learn to do this, can't we?
Absolutely. Of course, we all start with a certain level of proficiency, and you could say that some people perhaps have a higher level of proficiency than others. But one of the things that made me so passionate about conversation was the fact that I didn't really feel like I started with a high level of proficiency. And I would say that all of us have the opportunity to learn and develop and grow. Often the analogy I use, John, sometimes is if you go and look at these people who've got fantastic memories, so these are the people that will learn 24 packs of cards in a row and repeat every card. It's really interesting that they are not the people often that say, when I was a child in the playground, I had this fantastic memory, but it was anything innate. That they were stunning their friends and their teachers with it. Most of them say my memory was no better than anyone else's. But what they said was, at a certain point, I got really interested in how I could develop my memory. I realized it was a hugely untapped resource. And then they apply practice and attention to that area. And in doing so, they find that their memory can get better and better. And I often think conversation is a little bit like that. Of course, we've all got a certain level of proficiency at it. But if we start to pay attention to it and to really practice it, we can make incredible developments and advances in the way that we conduct conversation. And bearing in mind, of course, that we spend a huge proportion of our life and our day in conversation with others. If we can improve even 5-10% our ability to have conversations with other people, it makes a difference both to our relationships and our productivity in every aspect of our life.
Mm-hmm. Well, Judi Dench, the actress, says that she was quite terrified, actually, to get in front of a crowd or to speak or do things like that. But she learned to handle that by realizing that the fear is not who she is, it's something that she has. How can the average speaker turn things around and get to that realization that Dame Judi Dench realized?
Yes, I always think of her as a wonderful example, certainly as one of the greatest living female actors. The way that she describes it, where she says, I wouldn't be without it. She says, the longer I live, the more I act and work, the more frightened I feel. But at the same time, she says, I wouldn't be without it. As you said, she says, I've learned to have the fear. And so there's something I address in the book in Blamestorming is how do you deal with all the thoughts and feelings that come up. One of the things about us is that we're very negatively biased. And in a way, I think that's a throwback to our past, where it's a survival mechanism that we're always looking out for how we can defend ourselves. And so a lot of our feelings and our thoughts that we have, particularly in a situation where we've got to speak to a large group of people, is we say to ourselves, this is going to be terrible, I'm going to muck it up. We have great feelings of fear and anxiety. And I think one of the wonderful things is when you realize that you can have that and then you can still be in communication anyway. As you described it very well, sometimes we can use our feelings and our thoughts as a reason or an excuse not to be in communication. But actually, for me, one of the biggest realizations was that I could feel afraid or I could feel embarrassed and I could still speak up. And personally, I think that I found that incredibly liberating.
More than one talk show host has said that good conversation requires good listening. But what if you're in a conversation where listening is all you're doing with someone who monopolizes the session? Can you break that person's momentum and effectively get back to giving your own input? How would you go about that?
Yes, well, I think it goes both ways, doesn't it? On the one hand, I would say that listening in many ways is more important than speaking in a conversation. And sometimes it's remarkable the difference it makes to just be there and create the space for somebody else to speak. And certainly I found as a parent so many times, for instance, when my children have had something that they're dealing with or they've been upset, just giving them the space in the room to speak and to talk often allows them to resolve that and to move on. So I'd never underestimate the importance of listening. As you say, though, the other side of it is that we can monopolize a conversation and take over a conversation and monopolize somebody else's listening. There was a little story I use in the book of a person who goes to a party, and this man spent the whole evening talking about himself. And this person is getting really sort of fairly fed up with it. And at the end of the evening, this person says, listen, I'm really sorry. I've been talking about myself all evening, and now let's talk about you. And then they say, so what do you think about me? And so often in a conversation, what we do is we try and bring it back onto our own track. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes in a conversation, you're right, we do need to intervene, or we do need to, if we feel it's out of balance, try and bring the conversation back onto our own track or send it in a different direction. And one of the things in Blamestorming is really looking at some of the practices and the techniques that help you to have a greater sense in a conversation that it's going to turn out reliably in the way that you would want and in a way that works for somebody else. Really, conversations like a dance. And so I think it's more about how do you manage the process of the dance.
Well, you also work with business and large companies teaching conversation skills. What kinds of conversational challenges do you see in the workplace?
Well, one of the things, John, that people complain about and talk about all the time is that they feel that they spend too much time in conversations that don't make a difference. If you just take meetings as an example, I mentioned in Blamestorming a particular person in an organization where I asked him what his role was, and he described himself as a professional meeting attender. And I think really what he meant by that is I spend so much time in conversations where I feel the effort and the energy that I'm putting in doesn't translate into a sufficient and worthwhile output. And in the workplace, the particular position I take in Blamestorming is that you obviously can conduct conversation in many different ways. Sometimes it's a one-to-one conversation. It can be on the telephone. You could be in meetings. Conversation could even happen via email if it's two-way exchange, or via online chat. And so I think the real question is, how do you have those conversations be more productive? And of course, if you just take that example of meetings, I think there are ways you can set up meetings that give you a better outcome. One of the things that starts with is by having a clear purpose and intended result for the conversation, and by people really putting their attention in the conversation that they're in. So often at work, where we're moving from one conversation to the next. Although we're in a particular conversation at a given time, our attention is actually in the last one or the next one. So if you can improve the quality of the listening that people are having, particularly in meetings, bugbear for me would be people doing emails and being on their phone during a meeting, and simple practices where you start banning that sort of thing and improving the quality of the conversation that you're having and the level of attention that you're bringing makes an enormous difference to people's productivity.
Well, making an effective apology is certainly an important part of conversation. I've done this, and I guess just about everyone has. We say we're sorry for something, but we add conditions. I'm sorry, but if you hadn't done such and such, then this would have happened. That pretty much negates the apology, doesn't it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question there, John.
Well, the apology that we give often has conditions attached to it. I'm sorry, but if you hadn't behaved this way, you hadn't done this or that. And I'm thinking that really negates the apology. We can't expect to have our apology accepted if we put conditions on it, I would think.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think that an apology is really only an apology if it comes without a justification, and I think it's a very easy one to test. Where something's gone wrong with somebody, let's say at home, if we apologize and then justify it, as you say, it completely negates the apology. There's something very powerful, I think, about just being willing to say sorry. No ifs, no buts, no excuses or justifications, about just being able to say, I apologize, I'm sorry. And there's something with that where we end up taking full responsibility for what went wrong, even if to some extent it needs to be shared. But there's something about taking responsibility for our part in that often allows somebody else to accept it and then for us to be able to move on.
Well, to kind of switch gears just a little bit here, you also are a professional artist. Is there any connection? Art is a very different way of communicating, but have you been able to make any kind of connection between the way you do art and the way people converse? Any ties there?
I think the main thing, John, is that I see conversation as being something that's incredibly creative. And of course, that's right at the heart of being an artist as well. It's something where it really unfolds, or certainly for me, where I've had the best experiences of being an artist. It's not this experience of doing something sort of by numbers. It's a very dynamic process. And what I really love about conversation is you can go in with a plan of what you want to say, but really it all happens in the conversation, in the relationship with somebody else. So in that sense, I see conversation as being wonderfully creative. People often say to me, do you miss being an artist? And really the answer to that is, well, yes, in some ways I'd love to come back to it. But in other ways, I feel that this whole medium of conversation is so dynamic. It's all happening so fast. And there's an exchange going on all the time between two people. I couldn't think of a more creative process.
One last question, and then we'll let you go. Leave us with a piece of advice or a suggestion for those of us who may be heading into an important conversation, maybe one that's just ahead for us, and we're a little bit stressed, and we want to take one good point into that conversation. What would you suggest?
Sorry, you just cut out a minute again, John.
Okay, the conversation that someone may be having in the days or weeks ahead and is very nervous in anticipation. What piece of advice would you tell that person? Just one thing that you would say to them as they go into an important conversation, whether it be personal or at work or whatever. Is there some piece of advice you can give?
Yes, I think the main piece of advice would be firstly about preparing for conversation. I was speaking to a father the other day, and he has teenagers, and he said that he and his wife seem to spend an inordinate amount of time preparing for conversations with their teenagers, difficult conversations. So I think often thinking in advance about how you want to tackle it, particularly if you feel that there's a lot at stake in that conversation. It could be with a family member or a partner to raise a difficult subject. It could be with a colleague or a boss at work. And so I think the preparation is vital. Following that, I would say the most important thing is how you set up the context of the conversation and how you open it. So if we launch straight into it, and particularly we launch into a mode of criticism, we're almost guaranteed to get a bad response back. At the same time, if I set the context for it and say, this is why this conversation is so important to me, and the relationship that we have is very important to me, and that's how come I want to have this conversation with you, then there's a much greater chance that the conversation is going to go well.
Rob, where can we find your website?
Well, John, I've got a website which is called www.conversationexpert.com, and what I want to do is create that as a site where people can come to whichever area of life and a conversation they want to look at over time. That's something I want to build up with information and content and advice that they can use, so people can come to that site. Or I have another website called robkendall.co.uk, and they can find out more conversations through that site.
All right. The book is Blamestorming, Why Conversations Go Wrong and How to Fix Them, from Rob Kendall. Rob, thanks very much for writing the book, shedding some light on a topic that just terrifies so many of us. It's been a great help, a good book, a great read. And again, I thank you for not only the book, but taking time out of your evening where you are to be with us. So do come back again and visit us.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks so much, John.
All right.